The metallic click of the gun hammer snapped louder than the ticking clock, and in that instant my stepdad Victor pressed the cold barrel so hard against my mother's temple that I saw a thin red mark bloom on her skin. My mother whimpered, her body trembling, the papers scattered on the table fluttering like trapped birds. Victor slammed his free hand down, knocking over a glass of water that splashed across the documents, soaking the ink as if he wanted to drown every trace of her name from existence. Sign the papers, or else, he barked, his voice carrying through the thin walls of our house. From the corner, my stepbrother Kyle smirked like this was entertainment, his arms-crossed eyes gleaming with cruelty. Through the open blinds, I caught sight of Mrs. Howard, our elderly neighbor, frozen on the porch as she peeked in her hand over her mouth, too afraid to intervene, but unable to look away. Shame and horror painted every inch of the room, yet Victor only grew more vicious. He shoved the gun harder into my mother's head until she cried out, her voice cracking like porcelain. "You see Monica?" He sneered at me. "She was always weak, always useless. Just a signature and she disappears, and this house is mine." My mother's tears ran down her face, dripping onto the wet papers, mixing ink with salt water. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. My chest ached with rage, so heavy it felt like my ribs would shatter, but my face stayed calm. I stepped forward, the wooden floor creaking under my shoes, and I let him see something he had never seen in me before. Defiance. My mother whispered my name like a prayer, begging me to stay quiet, but silence was no longer survival. Kyle snorted, the neighbor gasped audibly outside, and Victor narrowed his eyes, certain he had already won. His thumb stroked the trigger, taunting me as if daring me to challenge him. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to freeze, to give in, but another voice, louder than fear, rose inside me, the voice of every night I had patched my mother's wounds, every insult I had swallowed, every bruise I had hidden under long sleeves. That voice told me this was the moment we had been waiting for. My breath steadied, my pulse evened out. I stared straight at Victor, not at the gun, not at the papers, but at him. He wanted to see fear in my eyes, but what he saw instead was a daughter who had outgrown her silence. The air thickened, almost vibrating with tension, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Mrs. Howard stumbled back on the porch, whispering, "Oh my God," to no one but the night. Kyle's smirk faltered for the briefest second, as if he too sensed something slipping out of Victor's control. And then I smiled. It was not nervousness, not surrender, but the calm smile of someone who had already planned 10 steps ahead. Victor blinked, confused, his grip tightening and loosening in the same second. He spat. "You think you can stop me?" I leaned in close enough for him to see that my hands weren't shaking, close enough for him to realize that the balance of power had just shifted. And then I spoke the words that sliced through the tension like a blade. Words that made the gun, the papers, and his years of control suddenly meaningless. Words that would haunt him long after that night because they carried the promise of an ending he never imagined. I was 35 years old that night, but in the seconds after Victor pressed that gun against my mother's temple, my mind dragged me back to when I was 10. The living room had been different then. Smaller furniture, softer curtains, the air filled with the smell of my mother's lavender candles. That was before Victor entered our lives. My real father had died of a sudden heart attack when I was 9. I remembered the cold November morning, the way my mother sat silent in her robe for hours, staring out the window as if she had been carved from stone. She was lonely, grieving, and vulnerable. When Victor arrived a year later with his pressed shirts and smooth words, he seemed like salvation. To my mother, he was a strong hand to lean on. To me, he was a shadow that stretched longer every day. At first, he brought flowers, cooked dinners, fixed the leaky faucet, but kindness was only the bait. By the time I was 11, he had moved in, and the first slap came soon after. He called it discipline. He told my mother she was too soft with me, that I needed a real man to show me rules. The sound of her pleading voice still rings in my ears. "Please, Victor, she's just a child." But her words never stopped his hand. By the time I was 13, I had learned the code of silence. Bruises hidden under sweaters, lies mumbled at school about falling downstairs, eyes lowered at dinner to avoid the spark of his rage. Gaslighting became his favorite sport. He would break a plate and then shout that I had done it. He would call me worthless, then whisper to my mother that I was lucky he even tolerated me. He built a cage out of words and fear, and he locked both of us inside. My mother tried to protect me in small ways. She would sneak into my room at night with ice wrapped in towels, pressing them gently to my bruises. She would stroke my hair and whisper apologies as if her love could erase the damage. But she never left him. Every time she thought about walking away, he reminded her of the bills, the mortgage, the shame of divorce. And so we stayed. The day that still burns in my memory happened when I was 16. It was my cousin's birthday party. The whole family gathered in the backyard with music and laughter. My mother wore her favorite blue dress, her hair pinned back with silver clips. For a moment, she looked free, happy. But when she laughed with my uncle too long, Victor's eyes turned dark. Later, inside the house, he struck her so hard she tumbled down the staircase. Gasps erupted from the party as people rushed to help. I stood frozen, staring at her crumpled body, feeling heat rush into my face until my vision blurred. Victor stood over her and growled she should know better. That night, I sat by her bedside, clutching her fragile hand, and swore silently that one day I would not just survive him, I would end his reign over us. That vow became the compass of my life. I finished high school with grades sharp as glass. While other girls dreamed of dances and prom dresses, I dreamed of independence. I worked 3 jobs to pay for college, graduated with a degree in education, and became a teacher. Teaching gave me dignity, a life outside his control. But even as I taught children to read and dream, I never forgot the monster waiting at home. Victor never changed. If anything, he grew worse. By my late 20s, he had consolidated every ounce of power. He controlled the finances, demanded that my mother put her name on joint accounts, then slowly drained them. He favored his son Kyle relentlessly. Kyle could crash a car or fail a class, and Victor would beam proudly. If I so much as came home 5 minutes late, I was berated for being irresponsible, ungrateful. Kyle became Victor's echo, sneering at me, mocking my career as a teacher, calling me a parasite who would never amount to anything. My mother aged visibly, her shoulders slumping, her eyes perpetually tired. She was alive but hollowed out, her spirit slowly carved away. There were nights when I wondered if she even knew she was still breathing. And yet she endured. Sometimes I hated her for it. Why did she let him keep us in chains? Why did she never walk away? But deep down, I understood. Fear had become her oxygen. She no longer knew how to live without it. It was when I was 30 that I began quietly collecting evidence. It started small photographs of bruises, recordings of shouting matches captured on my phone, copies of bills that didn't add up. At first, I didn't know what I would do with them, but gathering proof gave me strength. Each file, each recording was a reminder that I wasn't crazy, that the abuse was real, that someday I would use it. I hid everything in a locked box under my bed, the same bed where I had once cried myself to sleep as a teenager. The turning point came one evening when Victor smashed my mother's phone against the wall because she had dared to call a friend. Shards of plastic scattered across the floor, and I saw blood dripping from her hand as she bent to pick up the pieces. In that moment, I realized silence was no longer an option. I wasn't the helpless girl from years ago. I was an adult, and I had been preparing for this fight my whole life. That night, I called Detective Harris, an old friend of my father who had stayed in touch with me. I told him everything. His voice was steady, Monica. If you want to bring him down, you'll need more than bruises. You'll need proof of financial coercion, proof of threats, proof he cannot deny. From that day forward, my mission was clear. I would bait Victor into revealing himself. I would let him think he still had all the power while quietly gathering the rope that would one day hang him. And when the gun finally pressed against my mother's temple, I knew the trap was closing. The night after Victor smashed my mother's phone into pieces was the night something inside me shifted forever. I remember kneeling on the floor, helping her gather the shards of plastic and glass, her hands trembling, blood welling in tiny beads along her palm. She whispered apologies under her breath, as if she had been the one who destroyed it, as if she had invited the blow. I looked into her eyes and realized she had stopped believing rescue was possible. She lived as though the walls of this house were a prison with no doors, only locks, and Victor held every key. That was the moment I swore out loud for the first time that I would not allow his shadow to smother us anymore. I did not know how not yet, but the words slipped through my clenched teeth like a promise forged in fire. I will stop him, Mom, even if it kills me. She begged me not to provoke him, not to put myself in danger, but my vow had already taken root. From that day forward, I began to move differently. I let him think I was compliant, quiet, broken. I nodded when he lectured, lowered my eyes when he insulted me, acted as though I were shrinking into the corners of the room. But behind that mask, I was sharpening my resolve. I began studying his patterns like a predator watches prey. He always lost his temper when money came up. He always drank too much before demanding signatures. He always gloated after humiliating my mother in front of Kyle, basking in his son's laughter. And every time he repeated these patterns, I memorized them. I knew they would become the rope that would hang him. I invested in small devices, a voice recorder hidden in a lipstick tube, a camera disguised as a phone charger. At school, my students thought I was just another teacher with lesson plans and grading papers, but in reality, I was running a double life cataloging the crimes of the man who ruled our home. I also spent hours at the library combing through state laws on coercion, financial fraud, and domestic threats. The more I read, the clearer the path became. Victor thought he was untouchable, but the law had words for the things he was doing, words like extortion and intimidation. Those words could cage him if only I could prove them. Still, knowledge alone wasn't enough. I needed an ally. That was why I called Detective Harris. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but the moment he picked up and heard my voice, something in his tone softened. "You sound like your father," he said quietly, the same determination. I told him everything. The bruises, the insults, the threats, the financial manipulation. Harris didn't sugarcoat his response. "Monica, if you want to bring him down, you'll need evidence that no jury can ignore. Words are not enough. People like Victor twist them, make the victim seem hysterical, unstable. We need recordings. We need paper trails. We need to show he's not just cruel, he's criminal." I left that conversation with clarity burning through me like a fever. My vow had transformed into strategy. From that moment on, every insult he threw became a tool. Every document he forced on my mother became a clue. Every tantrum became an opportunity. I began to bait him carefully, not enough to expose myself, but enough to let his mask slip in front of my hidden devices. I asked small questions about money, just to ignite his rage. I stood closer to my mother when he was drunk so he would threaten us both. I watched Kyle with equal care. He was his father's shadow, but shadows leave trails. His arrogance would be his undoing, and I would be ready to record every word. It was exhausting to live this double life pretending to be submissive while secretly building the case that would save us. There were nights when fear nearly cracked me, when the memory of him looming over me as a child made me want to curl into silence again. But then I would touch the locked box under my bed, the one that now held recordings and documents, and I would remember that silence was no longer my inheritance. I was writing a new legacy, one built not on fear, but on resistance. The true turning point came 3 months before the gun night. Victor had forced my mother into a meeting with his lawyer, shoving a stack of papers in front of her, insisting she sign over half the property. I watched his smug smile as she hesitated, the way he tapped his pen like a weapon. When she finally broke down crying, I clicked on the recorder hidden in my jacket pocket. His voice, sharp as a blade, was captured perfectly. "If you don't sign, Linda, you won't have a roof over your head. You'll be nothing." That recording was my proof, my treasure. I remember lying awake that night, playing it back again and again, feeling my pulse steady with each replay. It wasn't just a threat, it was coercion. It was criminal. It was the crack in his armor I had been waiting for. From then on, I smiled more often in his presence. He thought it was weakness, the smile of a woman broken into obedience. He didn't realize it was the smile of a hunter who had finally set the trap. And deep inside, I knew the day was coming when the gun, the papers, and his reign would collide with the evidence I had been gathering. When that day came, I would no longer be the frightened girl. I would be the witness, the accuser, and the executioner of his illusion of power. In the months that followed, Victor grew more reckless. It was as though he sensed my mother's resistance was wearing thin and wanted to crush the last scraps of her will. He stormed through the house like a tyrant, his boots heavy on the floorboards, his voice echoing through the walls. He no longer waited for privacy to humiliate us. He shouted at the dinner table, sneered in front of neighbors, flaunted his power as if daring the world to stop him. Kyle mirrored him like a shadow that had learned cruelty before kindness. He strutted around the house, throwing his weight at me, calling me a parasite teacher, insisting that one day everything here would belong to him and his father. Sometimes I thought he believed it more than Victor did. One Friday night, I came home from work to find Kyle sitting in my chair, his muddy shoes on my stack of graded papers. He smirked when I asked him to move. "Go on, parasite," he said. "Make me." Before I could speak, Victor walked in with a beer in his hand and laughed. "She won't say a word, son. She knows her place." That exchange might have once silenced me, but now it fueled my determination. I went to my room, shut the door, and pressed record on my hidden device, whispering into it every word they had said. It felt almost ceremonial, a ritual of documenting, of transforming their abuse into ammunition. The more evidence I gathered, the stronger I felt. But Victor's escalation wasn't just verbal. One night, I heard a crash in the kitchen. I ran in to see my mother on the floor, clutching her wrist, a pot shattered beside her. Victor towered above her, his face red with drink. She slipped. He barked his spit, hitting the floor. I knew better. The bruise that bloomed across her arm in the days after was not from a slip. I took photographs in secret, timing them when she was asleep so she wouldn't protest. Each photo became another nail in his coffin. I began to catalog them carefully, dates, times, context. I kept multiple backups on a USB hidden in the lining of my purse, on a drive stored in a locker at school, even an envelope mailed to Detective Harris, marked for emergencies. If Victor ever discovered what I was doing, I needed to make sure the evidence would survive, even if I didn't. Meanwhile, his obsession with the house intensified. He pushed my mother almost daily to sign documents. Sometimes they were legitimate contracts. Sometimes they were blank sheets meant to trick her. I watched him grow sloppy, shouting threats, even when Kyle recorded videos on his phone, confident that he controlled the narrative. He thought those videos made him look strong. He never imagined one day they would serve as proof of intimidation. Kyle became more vicious toward me, too. Once he cornered me in the garage, blocking the door with his body, sneering that he could make me disappear if I ever got in their way. He smelled of beer and arrogance, and for a moment I feared he might actually hit me. But instead, he leaned close and whispered, "Dad says you'll be gone soon." That whisper chilled me, but I held my ground. When he finally moved aside, I ran to my car, heart hammering, and the first thing I did was write down every detail, every word, and store it with the rest. Escalation had become their pattern, but evidence had become mine. The community began to notice too. Mrs. Howard, the neighbor, once pulled me aside when I was taking groceries out of my trunk. She asked in a low voice if everything was all right. I wanted to pour everything out, but I only nodded and said quietly, "I'm working on it." Her eyes lingered on mine, filled with a mix of pity and fear. She had heard the shouting. She had seen the slammed doors. She was another silent witness to Victor's reign. It was during this time that I started rehearsing in my mind how it would end. I imagined the courtroom, the moment when recordings would play, when photographs would flash on a screen, when his words would no longer belong to him but to the law. Each time I rehearsed, the fear inside me lessened. Each time I imagined his downfall, I felt a little more free. But Victor must have felt something shifting too. He became paranoid, searching drawers, demanding to see phones, accusing my mother of hiding things. Once, he grabbed my wrist and squeezed so hard I thought the bones would snap. He hissed into my ear, "If you ever betray me, I'll bury you both." His breath smelled of alcohol. His grip bruised my skin, but my eyes did not break. I knew then that the line had been crossed. He was no longer satisfied with control. He wanted total erasure. That was when I decided to bait him into his biggest mistake. The plan was dangerous, but it was the only way to force him into exposing himself fully. I would wait until he demanded signatures again. wait until he was drunk enough to lose his mask, and then provoke him just enough to bring out the weapon I suspected he kept hidden. A weapon would mean prison, not just shame. Harris warned me it was risky. If he pulls a gun, Monica, you'll be seconds from death. But I told him the truth. We've already been dying for years. Better to face the bullet than the slow suffocation of silence. So I prepared. I tested my recording devices. I arranged my backups. I even practiced my expression in the mirror, the calm smile I would wear when the trap finally snapped shut. Every insult, every bruise, every humiliation had led to this. And when the night came when the gun pressed against my mother's temple and the papers fluttered like broken wings, I was ready. The day of the hearing arrived with a sky the color of steel. I woke before dawn, heart pounding, but hands steady. My mother sat at the kitchen table in silence, her eyes hollow from years of fear. Yet when she looked at me, there was a flicker of something new. Trust. She didn't ask what would happen. She didn't need to. We both knew the moment had come. I walked her to the courthouse, every step echoing like a drumbeat toward destiny. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of polished wood and paper, the murmur of other cases waiting to be heard. We sat together side by side, while Victor strutted into the room in his tailored suit, Kyle trailing behind him like a smug shadow. Victor smiled broadly, as if he owned the place, greeting his lawyer with hearty slaps on the back. He didn't even glance at us. To him, we were already defeated. His confidence was a mask, but one he had worn so long it clung to him like skin. When the judge entered the room, fell silent. The gavel struck once, a sound that jolted my memory back to every slammed door and every insult that had scarred my childhood. This time, though, the sound was not a threat. It was a promise of order. The proceedings began with Victor's lawyer painting him as a responsible husband, a man simply trying to protect his financial interests. They spoke of my mother as though she were fragile and confused, unable to manage property in need of guidance. My stomach churned, but I kept my expression calm. I had learned the power of silence, the patience of waiting for the right strike. Then it was our turn. My mother's lawyer, a woman with sharp eyes named Grace, stood tall and began to speak. She described years of intimidation control and threats. Victor snorted audibly, shaking his head as if dismissing it all as fiction. The judge raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Grace continued building the case brick by brick. Finally, she gestured toward me. "Monica, please step forward." My legs carried me steadily to the witness stand. I swore the oath, my voice strong, and took my seat. Victor leaned back in his chair, smirking, his arm draped casually over the backrest. He thought he knew what was coming. He thought he had already won. I looked directly at him as I began to speak. I told the court about the bruises, the smashed phones, the threats whispered in the dark. I described the night he shoved my mother down the stairs, the countless times he reduced her to tears. His lawyer objected, calling my testimony emotional, not factual. The judge allowed it to continue, but reminded me to provide evidence. That was when I nodded toward Grace. She pressed a button on a small speaker set up on the desk. The courtroom filled with Victor's voice, harsh and unmistakable. "Sign the papers or else." The sound seemed to vibrate in the very walls. My mother gasped beside me. The judge's eyes narrowed. The gallery shifted uneasily. Victor's smirk faltered for the first time. His lawyer jumped to his feet, shouting about context, but the judge silenced him with a single wave. More recordings followed, his voice calling my mother useless, his threats about leaving her homeless, his laughter as Kyle egged him on. Each clip was a dagger slicing through his facade. The final blow came when we presented the photographs, images of bruises on my mother's arms, timestamps and dates carefully cataloged, matched with hospital visits. The room grew cold as the reality of his violence stood undeniable in glossy print. Kyle shifted uncomfortably, his earlier arrogance draining from his face. I caught his eyes and held them until he looked away. Then came the moment I had rehearsed for months. Grace asked me, "Monica, can you tell the court what happened on the night of April 22nd? My pulse thundered, but my voice stayed calm. I described the gun, the papers, the way he pressed the barrel against my mother's temple. Gasps rippled through the room. Mrs. Howard, seated in the back after being subpoenaed as a witness, covered her mouth just as she had that night. And then I repeated the words I had said to him in that living room, the words that had made him hesitate. "Your gun can't silence the truth." The judge leaned forward. "Is this true?" Mr. Alvarez Victor's face turned crimson. He slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "She's lying! They're both lying!" His voice cracked with fury, the mask ripped away. Kyle stood abruptly shouting too, calling me a parasite, a manipulator, his words tumbling into chaos. The judge banged the gavel repeatedly, demanding order. But in that chaos, the truth was clear. The calm, smiling mask of control Victor had worn all these years had shattered in front of everyone. Bailiffs moved in swiftly, restraining him as he cursed and struggled. The judge's voice rang out above the noise. "This court finds probable cause of coercion, intimidation, and threat with a deadly weapon. Victor Alvarez, you are remanded into custody pending trial." The gavel came down with finality, and for the first time in my life, the sound felt like freedom. My mother sobbed beside me not with fear, but with release. I reached for her hand and squeezed it, and for the first time she squeezed back with strength. Outside the courtroom, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. I shielded my mother with my arm as we walked down the steps. The sky had cleared, the steel clouds breaking to reveal a slice of blue. Harris approached, his expression solemn but proud. "You did it, Monica. You gave him enough rope and he hung himself." I nodded, exhaustion washing over me, but beneath it a fierce satisfaction burned. For decades, Victor had owned our silence. Now his own voice was the key to his prison. The courthouse emptied slowly that afternoon, but the echoes of the gavel still vibrated inside my chest. For the first time in decades, Victor's voice had been silenced, not by fear, but by law. I held my mother's arm as we descended the marble steps, the weight of the moment pressing on both of us. Reporters swarmed with questions, cameras flashing microphones shoved into our faces. Did he really point a gun at her? How long had the abuse gone on? Did you ever try to leave? I shielded my mother and guided her through the crowd, refusing to let her endure another spectacle. Harris met us by the car, his eyes steady. He told us Victor had been denied bail because of the violent threat. He was being transported directly to county jail, awaiting a full criminal trial. 15 years, maybe more, Harris said. My mother closed her eyes, whispering a prayer of thanks under her breath. For her, the weight of a lifetime had begun to lift. For me, it was only the first step. The weeks that followed unfolded like the peeling of an onion, layer after layer of Victor's empire unraveling. The prosecutors built their case with the evidence I had given them, adding financial records that showed how he had siphoned money into Kyle's accounts. Subpoenas revealed offshore transfers, unpaid taxes, and forged signatures. Every trick he had used to keep us trapped was now a rope tightening around his neck. Kyle was called in for questioning. At first, he strutted in with his usual arrogance, but the recordings of his taunts and threats stripped away his bravado. When confronted with the evidence of his complicity, his laughter in the background, his own threats in the garage, his face drained of color, he stammered, tried to deny, but eventually admitted he knew about the coercion. The prosecutors charged him as an accessory. He was 23, cocky, spoiled, and suddenly facing the reality that his father's shadow could not shield him. My mother and I sat through the sentencing hearings. Victor raged, shouted, tried to twist the narrative, but every outburst only confirmed the truth. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts: coercion, intimidation, assault, with a deadly weapon, financial fraud. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 10. The words landed like a final hammer blow. Kyle received 3 years probation, stripped of any financial inheritance, his accounts frozen. He left the courtroom pale and silent, the golden child reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale. The house at last was safe. Legally, it belonged to my mother again. Watching her sign the final documents, her hands steady, her signature bold, I felt tears sting my eyes. She had signed away so many pieces of herself over the years, but this signature was different. This was not surrender. This was reclamation. In the days after our community shifted, neighbors who had once looked away now offered quiet support. Mrs. Howard brought over casseroles, her voice shaking as she apologized for never intervening. I told her the truth. Silence is what abusers count on, but speaking now still mattered. My students at school whispered about seeing me on the news. One little girl hugged me tightly and said, "My mom says you're brave." I swallowed hard, realizing that bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. For my mother, healing was slower. She walked through the house as though rediscovering it, touching walls, rearranging furniture, reclaiming spaces that had once been prisons. Some nights, she still woke trembling, expecting Victor's shadow in the doorway. But when she saw me sitting nearby, she would breathe easier. We were learning together what freedom felt like. One evening we sat on the porch as the sun set, the air warm and sweet. My mother turned to me, her voice soft. "You saved me, Monica." I shook my head. "No, Mom. We saved each other." She smiled the first genuine smile I had seen on her face in years, and in that moment I knew the cycle was broken. Victor was gone. Kyle was powerless. The house was ours not just in paper, but in spirit. The law had done what fear never could. It had carved justice out of years of silence. And as the sky darkened, I realized the vow I had made as a 16-year-old girl at the bottom of the staircase had finally been fulfilled. A year passed, and the house no longer felt like a cage. The air was lighter, the walls brighter, as though Victor's absence had stripped away years of grime invisible to the eye. My mother moved slowly at first, adjusting to freedom like someone learning to walk again. She planted roses in the front yard, their crimson blooms defiant against the gray memories that lingered in the soil. Sometimes I caught her just standing at the window, breathing deeply, as if finally convinced the nightmare had ended. I, too, was learning what it meant to live without fear, pacing the hallway. Teaching became more than a job, it became an anchor. I poured myself into my students, giving them the kind of steady encouragement I had longed for as a child. One afternoon, a boy handed me a drawing of a superhero with glasses labeled Miss Monica. I nearly cried in front of the whole class. To them, I wasn't a victim or even a fighter. I was simply someone who cared enough to see them. Healing didn't come without scars. There were nights when the echo of Victor's voice haunted me in dreams, when the imagined click of a gun jolted me awake. But each time I opened my eyes and saw the quiet of the room, I reminded myself the monster was caged. Justice had not erased the past, but it had ended its grip on the present. Kyle drifted away, stripped of his golden boy veneer. I heard he took a menial job out of town, bitter and alone. Part of me wanted to hate him forever, but another part pitied him. He had been raised in Victor's image, molded to cruelty, and without that shadow, he was nothing but a hollow man. My mother refused to speak his name anymore. For her, cutting him off was survival. For me, it was closure. We began to rebuild in small ways. We repainted the kitchen, once a battleground of smashed plates and slammed fists. We hosted neighbors for tea, filling the rooms with laughter instead of shouting. On Sundays, we walked to church together, my mother holding her head higher than I had ever seen. Each step was a declaration we were no longer prisoners. One spring morning, Grace, our lawyer, visited for coffee. She looked around the house, smiled, and said, "It feels different here. Lighter." She was right. The house itself seemed to breathe again, no longer bound by Victor's rage. Grace reminded me that our case had already been cited in other proceedings, helping women in similar battles prove coercion with evidence. That knowledge settled into me like sunlight. Our pain had not been wasted. It had become a weapon for others to wield. On the anniversary of Victor's sentencing, I returned to the courthouse steps. The sky was clear, the air sharp with the smell of rain-soaked concrete. I stood there remembering the girl I once was, the frightened teenager at the bottom of the staircase, the young woman hiding bruises, the teacher recording whispers in the dark. I whispered to her across time, "We did it. We kept the vow." That night, my mother and I sat on the porch together sipping tea as the stars blinked above. She reached for my hand, her grip warm, steady. "You gave me back my life," she said. I shook my head. "No, Mom. We took it back together." She smiled, her eyes shining, and for the first time in decades, she looked unburdened. The silence that settled around us was not the heavy silence of fear, but the gentle quiet of peace. Looking back now, I realize endurance was never weakness. It was the soil from which my strength grew, the foundation that carried me through years of darkness until I could finally step into the light. The lesson I carry, the one I want anyone listening to hear, is this: control thrives in secrecy, but truth thrives in exposure. Evidence is stronger than fear, and no matter how long the night lasts, dawn will always come.